Works like magic. Welcome all to the second in the fundamental series on climate. I'm Andreas Lang, I'm the course leader in the MA in Architecture, and I'm very honored to present this lecture series of the Spatial Practice Program. The fundamentals is quite an important reference point for our students within the kind of teaching and how we more actively embrace action towards the climate crisis, but it's also a part of a larger series of events that happen, from climate assemblies to exhibitions to kind of college-wide reflection on how we face and address the crisis. But also I'm very happy to welcome external guests, hoping that the urgency expressed here can carry outwards beyond the college itself. So thank you all for coming. To start with a little bit of sad news that Tom Dyckhoff sadly is ill. He's going to be better very soon. Yes, a bit louder so he can hear it. Oh, Tom, we miss you. Very kindly, Jeremy Till stepped in to share this evening's session. So before I hand over to Jeremy, I just want to point out there's no fire alarm drill planned for tonight. So if you hear it, it's real. Please make yourself to the front of the building. If you don't hear anything and the evening concludes, we're going to reconvene at the bar at the other end of the building. And I think that's all I have to say. And I hand over to Jeremy.
I'm so sorry to disappoint you. The only credibility I have is that Tom and I share a seminar on the MArch, and I go first and he goes second. And I've never dared look at the student feedback, because I'm sure it goes something like, well, the first guy was okay, but the second guy. Anyway, so this is the second. 2 weeks ago we had the first, which was about buildings, and we had a particularly good debate afterwards, and there was a really juicy bit where they started talking about political donors, also known as national house builders, and their effect on political policy, also known as something which maybe Claire's going to talk about in terms of the standards for homes. But this week we're going to pull back the camera and look at the scale of the city, and this is a necessary move for, I think, two reasons. The first is that, as the headlines of this series suggest, the climate emergency challenges some of the key principles on which architecture, and particularly architecture of the modern project, has been founded. So if you consider the 20th century and the modern project of the 20th century was to a large extent built on what were then seen as the virtues of progress and growth and plenty. And it's exactly those so-called virtues which have propagated and propelled the climate emergency. The climate emergency has been fueled by addictions to growth, addictions to plenty, and addictions to progress, because that fuel is that of carbon. And so, as part of that, architecture and the modern project of architecture in the 20th century has played the role of both handmaiden and symbol of these notions of progress, growth, and plenty. And therefore, to say that architecture is complicit in the climate emergency is not an accusation, it's a statement of fact. But what happens when those conditions of progress, growth, and plenty are no longer tolerable? Because the climate emergency makes them no longer tolerable. What then happens if the carpet is taken away from underneath architecture, in as much as the carpet has been made up of progress, growth, and plenty, and other things? And just at the moment I'm working, this is kind of right inside my head, because I'm working on a new research grant proposal with Tatiana Schneider, which we are calling Architecture After Architecture. don't suppose we get it because it's a slightly provocative title, but the notion is that what happens when architecture's principles are no longer tolerable because of the climate emergency, what does architecture become? And this evening we shift away from the building because one of the answers to that question, what is architecture after architecture, becomes a shift from the very normative description of architecture as the production of buildings into potentially a wider territory. The second reason that it's important to pull back this evening is that the common and I think right response to the climate emergency is not to see it as a fix, because a fix is an old-fashioned modern idea that there are technical solutions that would get us out of it, but actually to do with systemic change to a whole set of systems. And those systems play out most kind of poignantly at the level of the city, in as much as the city is made up of network of economies, of cultures, of environments, and of societal relationships. And so my interest in this project I'm doing is that if we're going to have change and recalibration of those systems of economy, of culture, of societal relationships, of environment, how then might that play out spatially? And in a way, the answer to the question, architecture after architecture, should address that, which could be actually quite optimistic. Although architecture may be on its knees, or should be on its knees because of the climate emergency, possibly there are new roles in which you can look at the spatial implications and spatial configurations that arise out of these systemic changes at the level, in particular, of the city. So that's why I think having this debate at the level of the city is important this evening, and we've got a fantastic group of people to do it. And now I turn to my notes. And if I introduce them, first of all, through their institutional affiliations, this isn't because they're not wonderful individuals, but because the response to the climate emergency is not going to be done through the heroic genius, male genius of the kind of who's going to go and fix it with a great new shiny building or floating harbours by Bjarke Ingels when he's just got back from Brazil. But is actually going to be done through collective endeavours. And so I'm going to introduce everyone at the start in the order they're going to speak. So first of all, we have Tiffany Lamb from New Economics Foundation. So full disclosure, I'm a trustee of the New Economics Foundation, so obviously think it's the most fabulous organisation in the world, which it is. If very roughly there are 500 economic think tanks in the world, let's just say, I'm making this up, 495 of them are tied to the neoliberal agenda. There's about 5 which aren't, and NEF is one of those 5, and has right from the start had its catchphrase to do with the people, the planet, and something else, which I should know because I'm a trustee, but looking at the relationship of economy, environment and society in a way which sees them as interconnected wholes. And particularly now, they did a piece of work some years ago called the Green New Deal, which has now been brought up to date, which I think is going to be one of the blueprints for the way that we look at things in the future. And Tiffany works in the consulting wing of NEF with her particular expertise is on cycling and inclusive cycling, but is going to, I think, be talking also this evening about the Green New Deal. Next is Claire Murray from both Levitt Bernstein, where she's head of sustainability, but also from the London Energy Transformation Initiative, LETI. And LETI were founded in 2017, but just recently have really hit some Twitter headlines in as much as they have been coordinating absolutely brilliantly the response to this document released by the government on behalf of the National House Builders, which basically says, through some contorted sort of green, carbon neutral wording, actually would allow house builders to design houses with less insulation than the present standards. And LETI have done an amazing job of pulling together evidence, scientific evidence, but also telling us all, and I hope lots of people in the room did, how to fit in that consultation. But Claire is also head of sustainability Levitt Bernstein, who have throughout their whole career, Levitt Bernstein being important in terms of, first of all, social justice, and then environmental justice, and Claire runs sustainability there. Then what we have, looking at, comes next, is Duncan Law from Transition Town Brixton. Now the Transition Towns are I think, a really interesting thing, because each has its own dynamic. Each has its own protocols and its methods of working. They're famous ones in Totnes or whatever. But if you actually look at a map of how many transition towns there are in Britain, it's a really hopeful map. So each of the transition towns, and transition towns basically say, how do we transition to a post-carbon economy and way of living? And the Brixton one is famous for things like the Brixton Pound and other initiatives which Duncan will talk about. Then we have Joe Gibbons, who is a landscape architect, set up J&L Gibbons some years ago, and is interested at working at the level of the city, and is also a trustee of Open City, which is a charity which looks at people-centered cities. And so we're talking about forests this evening, but in particular the relationship, I guess, between people, forests and city. Can't see you now. Something like that. There you are. That's good. Okay. And then the last speaker is Carlotta Conti from Dark Matter Labs. Dark Matter Labs is a laboratory which is an offshoot of 00 and has some of the same people. So 00 Architecture and Dark Matter Labs systems are all over them, and they are looking at the recalibration of systems and the interrelationship of systems as we might move to a post-carbon economy. And they're particularly interested in the way that this is also going to be distributed networks and democratic networks. So Carlotta was at the Architecture Association, but is now an urban researcher and systems designer at Dark Matter Labs, which are, I think, are really, if you should go and Google them, and 00, because I think that they are one a really good example of what I've been talking, what I hope for, which is this idea that what are the spatial configurations that will come out of the necessary changes that climate emergency confronts us with. So I've gone on a bit long, but I will now hand over to Tiffany.
Doing the presentation. Great. Thank you. I will be speaking about the Green New Deal and urbanism. So the New Economics Foundation pioneered the idea of the Green New Deal as a broad policy and program package back in 2007 or so to decarbonize the economy. And following the financial crash of 2008, that kind of died for a bit, but it's reemerging now, and there's a lot of momentum. Now the Green New Deal is more of a global movement about ambitious climate action and simultaneously reducing inequality. An important part of the Green New Deal is the just transition, caring about how we get from the economy we have today to a zero-carbon future in a fair way. And at NEF, that means engaging with people who work in high-carbon jobs, engaging in regions that will be hit very hard if we just transition to a more sustainable economy immediately. And engaging with unions is important to get buy-in and to ensure that there's an equitable transition. So just to sum up 5 key points of what the Green New Deal in the UK right now looks like. 1, decarbonize the economy in a way that enhances people's lives and works to eliminate social and economic inequality. 2, create millions of new, well-paid, secure, unionized jobs that guarantee healthy and fulfilling livelihoods for all. 3, transform our economy so the financial system serves the needs of people and the planet with an accountable and democratic government in the driving seat. 4, protect and restore vital habitats and carbon sinks and ensure a healthy environment for all. And this addresses the biodiversity emergency element of the climate and biodiversity emergency. And finally, promote global justice by supporting all peoples and countries to decarbonize quickly and fairly. This includes accounting for the exploitation of resources and communities, particularly in the global south. The Green New Deal has been elevated on the agenda back in the US, mainly led by Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And the new chair of C40 Cities, Mayor Eric Garcetti of Los Angeles, has prioritized a global Green New Deal for cities on his agenda, which means that inclusive climate action has to be at the heart of all urban policy and decision-making. But what does a global Green New Deal for cities really entail? So, inclusive urban climate action must do 3 things. 1, challenge the dominant technocratic approach to the built environment and climate action. 2, build a social license. So it's not just about being fair, but about being seen to be fair, which is why at NEF we engage with unions and high carbon workers. And finally, adopt an intersectional perspective, because ultimately an inclusive or Green New Deals for cities is about the right to the city. So on the first point, to challenge technocratic framings. A technocratic framing is a viewpoint that prioritizes quantitative data and emphasizes science, technology, engineering, and economics. Climate change has been largely framed as a technocratic issue, which in turn means that the solutions that are proposed are technocratic as well. And this limits the discourse and the imagination because it makes it difficult to bring up issues around gender and social inclusion because they don't fall into the categories of science, technology, engineering, and economics. So how do we change this paradigm? To build a social license, we really need to diversify from within. So in the built environment sector in the UK, women are just 14% of it. And when we look at the transport sector, which is one of the largest sources of emissions, especially in urban spaces, women are just 22% of the workforce. And in the UK, only 35% of BME built environment students enter the industry. This is important to note because the design solutions have to be inclusive, and how do we have inclusive urban design and planning when the people at the table making these plans, making these decisions do not reflect the pluralism of the populations they serve? But it's not just about diversifying, because you can't just add women or people of color and expect magic to happen. We need an intersectional perspective, which means an understanding that there are multiple aspects of identity, such as sex, sexual orientation, race, religion, age, and physical ability, that interact in complex ways to shape how people experience the world. An intersectional perspective also acknowledges that there are multiple kinds of discrimination and inequalities that are interconnected and therefore cannot be analyzed separately. So in terms of climate action, we need to be thinking about how poorer neighborhoods or communities of color are harder hit by air pollution and high carbon infrastructure. That's just an example. And ultimately, the right to the city is important to keep in mind when we think and talk about the Green New Deal, especially in the context of urbanism. The right to the city is an academic concept that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, and recently it's been emerging out of academia into global urban policy debates. It was enshrined in the UN New Urban Agenda in 2016, 2017, and I guess a standard definition of the right to the city is far more than the individual liberty to access urban resources. The right to the city is a right to change ourselves by changing the city. It is about democratic control over the city with the right to access, occupy, and use urban space. And the key is that we need to do this in a way that puts people and the planet first. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let me give me one moment. There you are.
The little.
Oh, yes. I don't use the phone.
Yeah, me neither. Hi there, I'm Claire Murray from Levitt Bernstein, but I'm here today representing LETI, the London Energy Transformation Initiative, and we have recently felt like we've kind of gone viral for all the good reasons, and so LETI are a group of professionals, academics, engineers, architects, clients, and everyone is welcome. We're now over 1,000 volunteers, and we set out. We were set out by Clara Bagnall-George, pictured there talking from Elementa, to change the London plan. But we suddenly realised that actually it didn't need to stop there, and after influencing the London plan, we decided that it was time to influence the rest of the buildings that we build and make sure that we design and build them properly from day one. So if you want to tweet about us, I don't know if we've got signal in here, but just in case you want to, but more importantly our website, because you can download everything I'm going to talk about today from there for free. So I'm going to start with a message from our planet. And this is a message from today, that the Antarctic hit 20 degrees today. That is unheard of, and never before has it become that warm. And it's quite a frightening prospect and something that we are now getting used to. But whether it's 5.4 million hectares worth of fire in Australia or floods in the UK from storms, we now know that we must act now, and act quickly. And the photo behind that is the built environment professionals getting together for the climate emergency marches back in August, September time, just to show the strength as a built environment and the steps that we need to take and the action that we want to see. So the science is clear. We're heading currently for 4.1 to 4.8 degree warming, and we know that we need to be more like a 1.5 or less. It's just incredible that we could continue on that path towards 4.8, and we need to shift, and shift now. So we need to look at the transition to zero carbon and work out how our buildings can get there and what we need to do to make that shift. So if this is our path to zero carbon in the built environment, then let you know that by 2030 that we need to achieve zero carbon in operation in 100% of our buildings. That means by 2025 we need to design 100% of our buildings to zero carbon. That's 5 years. If we work backwards from that, that means 2020, this year, we need to be designing 10% of our buildings as a minimum to zero carbon. And that's a massive, massive hill to climb, considering we've been letting lie before now. So LETI set out to develop a one-pager on the targets that we need to meet on our buildings, and this can be downloaded online. And this one-pager shows everything from the low energy use, the measurement and verification of our buildings, what kind of energy supply we need, and the zero carbon balance that we need on the grid to understand how many renewables can supply our buildings. This is about operational carbon. It doesn't touch on embodied carbon, and that's because we know we've got so much more work to do on that. But if this sets the targets, then we soon found that actually everyone followed, and for the first time we had consensus across the industry. We had the UK Green Building Council and Better Building Partnership working with us to develop that one-pager, and the RIBA, CIBSE and the Good Homes Alliance all supported it. So for the first time we had consensus, and that means that we can now move forward understanding what zero carbon means and start to implement it. This is where the Climate Emergency Design Guide came in, if the one-pager was the targets, then this is your tool. This is where you can look to find what you need to do, and this is a document here. It's 150 pages long, and it sets it all out quite clearly in there for you. We had over 100 volunteers write this document, which is incredible. I don't think you'll see that anywhere else. And we had a launch a few weeks ago, and we sold out over 500 tickets in 4 hours, which we couldn't quite believe because we'd all just done this in our spare time at weekends and in evenings. But it shows the power that we have as a collective, as a collaboration, working together in the industry to make change where change is not coming from government. We can stand there and say, we know it's not enough, and we can make that change ourselves and be part of that change. So just to run through a couple of things in the document that I think you should know if you don't already, and you can find out. Whole life carbon is made up of two parts. It's made up of operational carbon and our embodied carbon. Operational carbon is very much a balance, and embodied carbon is a circular. So those two things together make whole life carbon. Now, if this is operational carbon, then we call it, we've done some bottom-up and top-down modelling to work out how much our buildings should consume in use. On the left, we have our bottom-up modelling. This is how much energy the buildings could use if we reduce demand completely. And then on the right, we have our top-down modelling. That's how much renewables we have on the grid available to us to use at any one time. Now, we know that the consumption of the building and the renewables on the grid is a balance. And if we break that balance, then the UK is not going to meet its targets. And this is for new builds, because if we don't do this for new builds, we are stealing from our neighbours, and we're taking the energy from the existing builds, which we know are a much, much bigger issue to tackle. So there's no excuse for not doing this on our new buildings. So some of the targets we set in there, they're kilowatt hours per metre square metrics, and we believe that we need to move away from carbon as our primary metric and start looking at kilowatt hours per metre squared. That's because we can understand it on the metre, and that we know if we see these energy uses in our buildings, we can directly compare that to how they perform in reality. But how did we arrive at our EUI targets? Well, we took the top bar, which is our building regs compliant building. Then we said, okay, what's our best 5% of those buildings? Second bar, third bar, what's the best 2% that we've got in the country? Then we took our top-down modelling, and we said how much is available in 2030, how much is available in 2050 in the renewables on the grid, and then we came to our 35 kilowatt hours per metre squared target. So that's for residential, and we know that if we don't achieve that, then we'll upset that balance. So how do we get there? Well, we need to pull a lot of levers along the way. We know that we need to do things like heat pumps, we need to install MVHRs, we need to improve our fabric, we need to improve our designs. And every single one of these pieces will get us there. But we can't just pick and choose some of these items. We have to do them all. So what difference does a window make? What difference does your orientation of your building make? You need to be considering which way your homes are facing, how big your windows are, and the difference on the kilowatt hours per metre squared per year that makes. So whether you've got a south-facing building with a low heating demand, or a north-facing building with a high heating demand, we are in power of that. We need to be changing these and designing better. And then how exposed our buildings are. So whether it's a bungalow or whether it's a flat, we need to understand the exposure and work for it to make the most efficient building that we can. It's no longer acceptable to make buildings that are inefficient for no good reason. So if that was operational energy, and operations are balance, then embodied carbon is a circular loop. We know that when we build our buildings, we emit a lot of embodied carbon, and embodied carbon is in that first day one item. But then we continue as as we go on through the years, we continue to use the operational energy in yellow. There's a few more embodied carbon items along the way, and that's through maintenance, repairs. And then there's a big embodied carbon at end of life when we dispose of our buildings because we're not continuing that loop. But if we put it into context, there's a lot of discussion about whether we should be dealing with our embodied carbon or our operational carbon. But at Letty, we're saying you need to deal with your operational carbon first. The first bar shows the operational carbon if we continue at building regulations now with the yellow and our embodied carbon underneath it. That shows the ratio of the two. If we reduce our operational carbon, which we should be doing, we know how to do, it's easy to do, then before we know it, our operational carbon is a small part of that carbon budget and our embodied carbon is a much larger portion, at which point we can begin to understand it and reduce it. Embodied carbon is really important, but operational carbon must come first because we know how to do it. So we now are learning about embodied carbon so that we can do it better as soon as possible. Just to say that the guide has some archetypes inside it, and I think this is really useful for everyone because it shows how to design buildings and low energy builds. It gives window percentage areas, it gives form factors, so they're really design items there available to you. And these archetypes for small, medium and large scale housing, schools and offices show you the 75% of our buildings built between now and 2050. So we know where we need to get to, but that means starting now. That means that we must meet this 10% now. So I'm going to finish with a quote from David Attenborough. I won't read it out to you, but effectively we know where we need to be and we need to take ourselves there, and it's no longer an excuse not to. Thank you.
Good evening. Duncan Law from Transition Town, Brixton. Can I just have a show of hands? How many of you are architects or directly connected with the built environment industries? More than half. Brilliant. So the question, overarching question, is architecture as we know it incompatible with our future? And that's a picture of architecture as we know it, as practiced. And it looks very much like that carbon graph. That is embodied carbon being put in place. And this is the architecture as we know it, as we live in it every day. I live in that street, around the corner from that estate. And where's my button? Oh, I should, sorry, I'm not looking at the order. This is a quick introduction to the transition movement, which is about 15 years old and is probably the fastest growing still positive movement for change in the world. And it's about harnessing the genius of the community to reimagine the way we do everything and make the future happen here and soon. But coming back to fundamentals, actually, I'm sorry, this is, I'm going to go to this slide and then back. So in relation to the first slide, the problem, 99% of the problem already exists in our existing built environment, and we're going to have less capacity to knock it down and rebuild. So we're going to have to make the best of it. 1% could be solved by new building. So what do we need to do to the built environment to have a good future? To have a future at all, fundamentally, we've got to do rigorous embodied carbon along the lines that Claire was talking about, but we have to avoid the spike because we have a very short time window to be at carbon neutrality. And the more we put in by trying to do sustainability, the nearer we are to the edge of the cliff. We have to retrofit all existing buildings. 10% of UK carbon emissions come from heat, and 10% of global carbon emissions come from concrete. So there is a little bit of a cleft stick. And then we do zero carbon new build and reduce transport in the process. So just going back to some fundamentals. City making was new to me. There's a book, which I haven't read, But I know about placemaking, so I assume it's placemaking for the city. And I would say we don't need to make any more cities. We have to think about remaking. We have to be focusing on what's already there and transforming it. So what's the future? And can we? Well, we're at a complete turning point. This is the critical decade when we can decide whether to have a future or not. And if we screw it up, simply nearly everything else is futile. So our future's got to be low carbon. It's got to be local. That's inevitable. We cannot carry on moving people and stuff around the planet willy-nilly. We have to build in resilience because change is already built into the climate system. We have to support nature because that's the other side of emissions, what the planet can take out. And at the moment we're trashing it and covering it with concrete. And fundamentally, because we live in the Anthropocene, we have to look after people because people are the agency that are going to make this happen or not. And it has to be just, otherwise there will be people kicking back against it, and it has to be better because otherwise nobody wants to go there. Cities are a function of lots of people in a small space. So it's as much about people as it is about the stuff in the space. It's about, the transformation particularly is about social organization. And cities concentrate people, stuff, imagination, productivity, and they outsource to supply. And that in itself makes a real problem for zero carbon, for local, for resilience, for supporting nature. It's a real problem, but we can do so much more of it than we are currently. How will cities change? At the moment, they are the magnet. More than 50% of the population of the planet live in cities, and people are still coming in the belief that the streets are paved with gold, or they'll get some trickle down. Perhaps we need to re-agrarianize our society. We need to move people out to be doing food production on a small, intensive scale in a sustainable way in the countryside. That means fewer people in the city. What will happen if we downsize the population of the city? If we can incentivize people to move out? Don't know. What do you do with empty buildings? I can imagine what to do with Canary Wharf. We grow tomatoes in it. Canary Wharf tomatoes. So transformation, how do you do transformation? Well, the only way of doing transformation, as far as I can see, is by pull. And by engaging everybody in wanting it. So they have to get benefit in the process. And the benefit can come in the form of connection among people. That's one of Neff's wonderful 5 pillars of well-being. Learning, giving, engagement in doing, being part of the solution. And the solution, and this is over to you guys, especially in terms of the built environment, has to be more desirable than the present. So you've got to make retrofit look amazing so that people prefer their retrofitted house to their Victorian icon. It's a huge challenge, but this challenge is the opportunity to get real about the planet, to connect with our place and our people and our power and new possibilities, and to change the way we do everything. People say we need revolution before, we need to solve poverty before that. No. We need to solve the carbon problem or we don't have anything to work with. But in the process, we should be able to do system change. We must be able to do system change because we have people, and people have imagination and creativity, and working together in collaboration, they can do completely amazing things, and I'm going to try and give a window on that. So the politics of belonging, the idea of getting active in your space, can bring transformational change from the bottom up, and there are no non-radical solutions, and business as usual is dead. Done that one. So it needs consent, transformation, and it needs participation. So this is a quick guide to how. It needs vision, and you're visionary people, but it needs vision from everybody. It needs a collective vision, placemaking. It needs community engagement. It needs places for people to participate and get their shoulder to the wheel. We need to create replicable models, what I call catalogue solutions, so that the difficult stuff like retrofitting Victorian houses, people aren't going, oh, I don't know how to do it. They can just go, that guy's done it, he's costed it, there are the solutions, that's the best material, there are no downsides. And we need to harness the pull, we need to make people want it. So is city making a nice thing to have, or is it absolutely essential? I would say it's absolutely essential, because if we can't engage 7 going on 9 billion people in this transformation, we'll fail. We've lost the war. We need to make it something that everybody wants. And there's a tipping point out there that we're moving towards. But we have to keep it positive, and we have to keep it beautiful. So vision changes everything, changes the chemistry. It goes from difficulty, awfulness, graphs, to I've just seen the future and it's amazing and I want it. And when I get up in the morning, I can't unvision that. I have this thing that's pulling me towards it. This is an estate in Brixton. A friend of mine lived on it 10 years ago, and she had a vision and she photoshopped it. Every one of those pictures has got 100 potential projects in it. Get a few people together and say, solar panels on roofs, alongside rooftop gardening, with sun spaces, windmills next to Brixton Windmill. Why not? Update it. All of those can become future projects. And that's what we did. We used tools like open space, which is a kind of white magic, getting people together to talk about what they want to talk about, the issues that are foremost or arising in their minds. This was 11 years ago, talking about the future of our food. And it's transformed what's happening in Lambeth. There are 200 community growing spaces coordinated by Incredible Edible Lambeth. A local box scheme that was started in that room. The Lambeth Food Partnership, dealing with policy and how Lambeth Council can engage. This is another tool that has been done several times by the Transition Network. It's called Pop Up Tomorrow, and they did it in the Battersea Arts Centre in the autumn, basically getting a couple of hundred people together to decide what they want to talk about, and then to invent projects and make them semi-real in a space in a day. Planning for real on steroids. This is us doing the projects that were in that vision. A group of us got together, Brixton Energy, we identified roofs, we did all the due diligence you need, and then we installed 100 odd kilowatt peak of solar, paid for by local investors. This one, 3 projects later, the Secretary of State is in the middle of the picture, with his junior minister to the right. Repowering London now helps projects in Hackney and Ealing and all over Vauxhall, and we're doing solar schools in Lambeth. Working on business and economy, we had a conference for a day, which was pretty scary, about how do you localize an economy in a city. And we decided to go with a local currency, the Brixton pound. That was the first iteration. The second iteration, with the famous Bowie £10 note, you could pay by text, the first in the world. That is now the way the Bristol pound operates. And the most recent iteration, the most amazing community cafe using surplus food. Remade in Brixton, our Waste as Resources group repurposed some undercroft garages into the Remakery, Brixton's reuse centre. Cover girls reclaiming old furniture. Beauty out of waste. So, quick nod at some things you might like to look into. The 15-minute city is a plan for Paris, where every bit like the Garden City, where all your resources, cultural and necessity, are within 15 minutes. Here's some other things you might look at for retrofit. Retrofit Works, a cooperative model for harnessing small-scale traders and doing retrofit really well. It's amazing. In Bologna, the Civic Imagination Office, the laboratory of the city in Mexico City, the Preston model of localization. And my challenge is to you, as architects, is get carbon literate, read Letty, it's amazing. Do a permaculture design course, because that's about systems, and it's about working with the forces that operate, people, nature, flows in the landscape. Passive house, learn urban food growing, because God, it's got to be in everything. I have a principle: if we build something, it increases surface area, it should increase productive space. We should be able to grow more on a building than on a bit of land. Make it happen. Put pattern language by your loo and read it every day. Christopher Alexander's absolutely amazing book. Get involved in city remaking, retrofit, join Retro First campaign, find your community and get active. That's fundamental. It may be a professional community, but place is really important. Transition Network and XR is doing amazing local organising, a really good process. And to the profession, insist on the building regs, design for low carbon and people, sterling price should be only for low carbon buildings, organise more retrofit prizes, and organise a competition for architects working with contractors to solve particular problems, external insulation, conservation areas, heritage, retrofit, and so on. This was a guy who built a zero carbon house in Brixton, completely gorgeous piece of work. Knock on the door. When he opened it, excuse me, we're the government. We've just put zero carbon housing into policy for 2016, but we don't know what it looks like. Can we come in and see? So you see, individual action can have absolutely seismic results. And next door, he's built a super passive house. That's me, that's it. Good luck, thank you.
Oh, it's true. You came.
How do I do it?
I have no idea.
Okay, just that one probably.
Yeah, I will try.
Great.
You can,
Is that yours? Great.
you can also use these.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Hi, good evening. I'm a landscape architect, and as landscape architects, and there are several in the room tonight, we see the city as a landscape. We see the landscape underlies the city, and with it, all its natural systems and how they've been disrupted. Oops. Sorry. In our work, there's a common thread, and that is that we protect, just like you're talking about retrofitting, design and deliver the urban forest as part of every job that we undertake at a strategic level. And this is the fantastic work that Mayor Ken Livingstone initiated back in 2000, and we were one of a group of practices who mapped all the green infrastructure of London, dropped away the 33 London boroughs boundaries, and looked at the whole city as a landscape, down to working at strategic grassroots level, and this is the Dalston Eastern Curve, which was grown out of action research on the ground in collaboration with MUF and Exist. And everything in between. That starts, you have to start at home. So this is my home in Islington. We plant trees in Hackney. This is the Canal Park in Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. In Croydon, where we're working with Liza on Ruskin Square. Doing a management strategy for all the green infrastructure at the Barbican in the City of London. Restoring historic landscapes, holding what's the current asset, grafting in the new to perpetuate the landscape for future generations. In creating cities, we have created new forms of habitat, to which in evolutionary terms we're only just adapting to. It is surely our responsibility to ensure that our cities are not only fit for purpose, but they also flourish, providing an environment for humanity to thrive, a place for environmental justice, resilience, social cohesion, and joy. Above all, at this time of climate and biodiversity emergency, when once again England is underwater, the solution is not heavy engineering. It is to design with nature, to appreciate the natural systems, where they've been disrupted, and how we can modify them with the current situation. So what is the urban forest? The urban forest is defined as a complex ecosystem that increasingly we have come to understand resides within a dynamic landscape of the city and is integral to the city's function and to its experience. Urban forestry redefines the city as a dynamic, organic structure of remarkable biodiversity. This is the detail of the flower of the horse chestnut tree. And there's an enormous amount of biomass embedded within the fabric of our city, marking time through the changing seasons and the natural cycles of growth and decay. The urban forest is an essential part of the character and the heritage of the urban and the peri-urban environment. The habitats that forests create, if well managed, are complex, diverse, and enchanting. Trees connect time and heritage over centuries. They are structurally astounding, shaped not only by the prevailing climatic conditions, the atmospheric conditions, but also anthropogenic and geological influence. Trees anchor the ground, hold open the soil. The effect of being drenched in woodland beauty can be life-enhancing, and the urban forest is about people. This is Epping Forest in the heart of Walthamstow. The urban forest provides critical infrastructure to life in the city. And most people, when they talk about critical infrastructure, think of a bridge and a road. And I say that the urban forest is one such critical infrastructure. London's urban forest provides a range of nature-based services that delivers multiple environmental benefits to us Londoners. The scale and effectiveness of these benefits, such as air quality improvement, carbon sequestration, or temperature reduction, are directly influenced by the way we design, manage the resource, and the decisions and actions that affect its structure and composition over time. It is, in fact, a constant work in progress, and it's never finished. Indeed, the canopy cover of all the trees together, and when we say the urban forest, we're talking about all the trees in every single backyard, front yard, street tree, woodland, and parkland, that this is capturing the imagination, and it's promoting a holistic attitude to the arboricultural resource management. The urban forest contributes so much to biodiversity, the character of the city, and the quality of life. We have a London environmental strategy. It's the first one. It was published last year. And in that, it describes the evidence that 8.5 million trees that we have, for instance, in London, has been scientifically measured in terms of air quality, carbon uptake, intercepting and holding back rainwater, to be worth approximately £133 million per year. The cumulative impact on mental resilience as a result of being in contact with nature stays long after as a kind of slow release. Not surprisingly, really, as we must remember that we are actually part of the ecosystem. Humanity, if we operate not in an egocentric way, but in an ecocentric way, then we would do well for ourselves. Urban forestry is a complex mosaic, a holistic approach to a phenomenal asset anchoring the underlying landscape of the city, a beautiful, refined, responsive, and elegant system that is interconnected intimately with the lives of people, a cultural and ecological inheritance. One might say, no trees, no future. If cities are growing at a pace, then why can't the urban forest? Strategically planted, it might save us. Make a city that we actually want to live in. Nature is the forgotten climate solution. Thank you.
hello everyone. As mentioned by Jeremy, I'm here on behalf of Dark Matter Labs, who is a discovery, design and development laboratory looking at supporting cities in just climate and technological transition that is fit for the 21st century's wicked problems. And I'm glad I'm talking last, actually, after this brilliant talk on urban forestry, because I'm now going to try and discuss, once we have, I guess by now, understood how great and important and perhaps even supportive towards this transition urban forestries are. How are we going to actually make it happen in terms of funding and contracting? So I'm going to try to start this kind of proposition by switching our understanding of what we currently mean by how do you value trees to how do trees value you. So we know that across the world and in Europe, cities are pledging higher and higher targets for urban afforestations. But these pledges are either failing or doomed to fail. So we know that actually about 50% of our trees are failing to make it post 10 years. And that beneath our feet, there's what they call the trench warfare. So it's actually incredibly difficult to achieve the targets that were met that should supposedly help us. And this is happening because most councils still understand trees as cost. So in their balance sheet and in the balance sheet, trees are still understood as cost and not as valuable assets. And some of you might remember back in 2017 and 18, Sheffield, that was one of the most renowned cities in terms of its urban forests, was actually, its urban forests were actually decimated. And this happened because the council subcontracted its urban forestry management, planting and management to a company that basically understood that it was more cost effective to replace flourishing, elderly, and majestic trees with small saplings. So for them it made sense, right? It was just cheaper. And so they did it, and we allowed them to do it. So here you can just see a quick diagram. It's going a bit fast, but essentially what this is saying is that if we keep on planting trees or small trees in conditions that don't allow them to flourish in the same way as they should, we essentially will never get those benefits that they know they could give us. So trees are giving us benefits, more or less the main amount of benefits after 50 years that they've been planted. So if our trees keep on dying, you can kind of make the maths. So this is something that goes back quite a little bit far. In 1869 in Massachusetts, it was the first council that started giving to tree wardens the kind of the role and the responsibility to be the carers of trees. But they were the carers of proper trees. So they understood essentially trees in the same way as they understand a lamppost or a bench. However, we know that our science, and I think this has been iterated to its full extent in the previous talk, they can be much more than that. And not just from a scientific point of view, but they can actually be companions. They can be communities, they can be providers, they can be expert witnesses, data stories, they can be economies. However, if you look around yourself, in most cities, these are still political pledges. And political pledges about numbers of trees planted, not about, maintaining them. So we propose that, as has been also iterated before, we find new ways to procure, care, and maintain for trees as infrastructure. And we can now do that because our technologies are allowing us to understand that 1,500 microplots in San Francisco can be as powerful as funding restoration of a whole sewage infrastructure. And this sewage infrastructure would cost the council about £1.5 billion, and this can be actually much more cost effective when we're talking about stormwater elevation, and even the energy that it costs to transport that water to the water facilities. We now can do that because if you start to look into, and maybe some of you might be interested in it, when we start to look at natural capital evaluation, so how do we essentially transact and understand our natural capital in monetary terms? What's happening currently, and this is a study that came from a urban forestry project in Cardiff. Essentially, we understand them as a bundle of financial benefits. So I think also the previous speaker was mentioning, we basically understand that $1 in this case put in from the council equates $5 that are coming back to us in terms of ecosystem and healthcare benefits. And what we argue is that this is no longer enough, because this doesn't actually allow us to understand the complexity of the benefits that this gives us. Because once it's bundled in one number, nobody can actually claim it or pay up front for it. So we can now actually understand and start to split out all of the different benefits from in individual terms. And more than that, we can actually start to link it back to the financial beneficiaries. So as I mentioned before, for example, an example of that could be the energy costs that, for example, Thames Water, or in this case was Cardiff Waterway, will reduce their costs in transporting essentially all of the water that might be draining here in Canary Square all the way to the water management facility. So you can start to calculate that reduction in costs and essentially start to put in place contextual and incredibly kind of smart ways of understanding our urban forests, not just as aesthetic pleasures, but actually as functional drainage system for our cities. In the same way, for example, council have to pay huge amounts when it comes to the recycling of, when they bring to the landfill more essentially garbage. So if you start to understand your urban forest not just as planting trees, but also as ecosystems of gardens, as was mentioned before, also planting and kind of growing fruits and vegetables that also can become places where you compost your local food, etc., etc. So you can start to understand that in terms of saving from council point of view. So that again can become preventative investment to save for future costs. But this is not at all an easy task. In fact, if some of you might perhaps have been to the Milan Triennale or is interested in the topic, might have heard of Stefano Mancuso, who is basically arguing that we are not just unable to value our ecosystem, but we literally cannot see it. And by this we mean, if you look at all of the depiction of the Noah's Ark, not even one single seed was brought on board. However, there is other example which around the world are giving us the hope that this refound relationship between human and nature is starting to happen. In these cases, Sydney essentially gave to each tree an email address so that citizens could essentially say, look, the tree is ill, or essentially a trunk has fallen. And many citizens started to write love letters to trees. And finally, I think, again, looking up Simard, she's one of the most brilliant arboriculturists in the world, who started via different experiments discovering the wood wide web, which essentially, in very simple words, starts to uncover that forests are not just competitive kind of ecosystem, but they are collaborative ones as well. So they do not just exchange nutrients through a network of fungi underneath the soil, but also they exchange information. And so we must change our understanding of trees as object to trees as network. And just like as a final note, I would say once we start to kind of re-understand this relationship between human and ecosystem, and perhaps think about the possibility of using technology to essentially micro-contract at a very, very large scale the funding and the maintenance and the care of this urban forestry plot, we need to start acknowledging that we not just need to recreate a new type of social contract between us as citizens and the state, but also we need to start understanding that the social contract needs to include the laws of nature and our ecosystems as well. So we're not just going to talk about algorithmic social contract when it comes to understanding how the back end of technology occurs, so being able to all of us, make it transparent to all of us to understand it, but also talk about almost not just society in the loop, but commons in the loop of algorithmic governance. Yeah, that's it.
So thank you so much. That was fantastic to hear some hope, actually. So ranging from Tiffany's setting out of principles which are backed up because it comes from NEF with huge amount of research and evidence. Claire's amazing example of what 1,000 people can do or 100 volunteers can do. Duncan's real-life examples of change, and then those two very complementary things on forests. So I'm afraid I have to sort of talk about the elephant in the room, which is politics and economics. And to say that today our Prime Minister has just appointed Alok Sharma as the new chair of COP26 in Glasgow, the essential climate change thing. And Alok Sharma has one of the worst voting records in Parliament on climate change. So the realities of the political system that we're facing in this country here and now in relation to what needs to be done, the realities of the dominance of a certain economic model, which is completely antithetical, as I briefly talked about, to dealing with the climate emergency, positions a kind of a brute reality against the hope which the five of you talked about. So my question is, and I don't know, maybe Duncan, you could start it, is do you think that the blossoming of 1,000 locals is enough to resist the top-down denials which are coming from our politicians and from the economic system?
Yeah, we're in a sticky place with our current government. But I think we make a mistake if we think of those in power as leaders. They follow where the people they look to give them space to go, if you see what I mean. And this government is largely following where money leads, but it's also elected, and it also follows where the zeitgeist and its electorate want it to lead. So there's a kind of race, as I said, between the tipping point of climate change and the tipping point of consciousness. But if you look at the changes that have occurred in the last 18 months in the tipping point of consciousness in political and business and local government spaces, it is mind-boggling. I'm an optimist and I believe in zeitgeist. I would never have believed the story of the last 18 months if you told it to me 3 years ago. Climate change is now seriously part of everybody's agenda. Businesses, they're never going to race fast enough, but they're racing to meet stupid targets set by the government. We need to get ahead of that curve. So all I can say is just keep changing the zeitgeist, and you as a profession, create a lot of it. Designers create a lot of it. I'm not arguing for eco-consumerism. We need less stuff. We need fewer new buildings. But there's a brilliant book by George Monbiot, which I cited, called Out of the Wreckage, a New Politics for a Time of Crisis. And he talks about the ability to get rid of the neoliberal lie of competition and individualism and alienation, and get back to the altruistic nature, the cooperative nature that is fundamental to human beings, and change politics by pushing up the earth from below, and also building resilience by collaboration and cooperation. And that's my hope.
Does anyone else want to pick up on my challenge?
I perhaps would like to maybe, I don't know, for my perspective, I would almost say that in the moment in which we start to align incentives, and I think politics is just, the kind of, as you were saying, it just follows the kind of economic turn that the country has taken. And in a sense, if you start to reframe the conversation from one of degrowth to one of actually exponential, essentially, energy and human flourishing, and one, on the other hand, of redistributing that energy, then you see almost the creation of new opportunities, rather than saying, okay, we're going to stop, we're going to essentially reduce a certain kind of production. We're just going to create a new one, right? Because all of the things that we've been talking about, they are productive activities. They're just different ones from the one that we've been taught, in universities, and the one that we actually know. So they actually create new economies. So I think I mean, I don't know, this is probably totally, naive and an illusion, because, but I do believe it's about creating incentives. So in the point of talking about urban forestry, if you start to expose the fact that not tackling this issue will create future incredible amount of costs in terms of, when we start talking about flooding and, the costs that is actually broken infrastructure is bringing to the government, I think we start to have a different kind of conversation. So, yeah.
So the next thing I'm interested in, because it's very in my head at the moment, we had a meeting following the Climate Assembly today, in which a bunch of proposals, which were mostly incredibly productive, pragmatic and realisable, came forward. But then there was another conversation going on about urgency. And Claire, you talked about your map of urgency is good, but if you've been in a room, and then I had a student came to see me who made it even more urgent, is your solution urgent enough, or are you just trying to be as practical as you are? Because the urgency which is now upon us in relation to even the emerging science, every single piece of scientific evidence that is emerging is worse than the one before. So what do we do about that urgent? How do we all act in an urgent manner?
Yeah, so I think to come back to that, it's so important that we act urgently. Letty is saying that we need to be zero carbon by 2030. Greta has said it's 2028. Our government is saying 2050. So Letty are 20 years ahead of our government, and still we know that's not fast enough. Still we know that we're going to struggle to meet those targets, but we have to try, and we have to go as fast as practically possible. I think there's so many things that we could be doing to go faster, but it means that we all need to change, and change now. And whether that's responding to our Part L consultation, which was pretty poor, building regs outcome, and what the government now does with that information, and how many people have indeed responded, we don't yet know. But we can only hope that what we suggested and what we put forward, that they begin to listen to, because it's just crazy that we would even begin to go backwards right now at a time when we need to be moving faster than ever before.
Anyone else on urgency and timing?
Yeah, I think that I'm sure all of us in the room feel that there's absolutely no place for apathy at all. But you don't want to create this sense of fright because it seems such an enormous challenge, and therefore you're kind of caught in the headlights, and then no one knows what the hell to do. So I think there needs to be a lot of imagination about breaking it down and offering, being generous with all our knowledge and helping individuals make a lot of small changes. And if you add up a lot of small changes in a city context, times that by 8.5 million or 8.6 million, that's a lot of difference. And I think that there is, so it's partly to enable community leaders, very much like Transition Town are doing, to give ideas and to be generous in those ideas of how you can start at home and then build out into the community. It's partly saying to people, to companies like Thames Water, if you simply put into your bill something that would disconnect a downpipe and would turn that into a collection, a way of collecting water rather than treating it as a waste product, then everyone would just literally saw off the bottom of their downpipes so that it doesn't go into the sewer and translate it back into a little patch of garden. I mean, there's so many simple things that can be done, and or plant a tree, you know, in the front garden, on the back garden, whatever, in the park, work with the Woodland Trust. I mean, there's so many different small things that can be done, which small steps that add up because of cities being such large organisms into something significant. And I believe that there is, with the National Park City movement, which is a crazy idea of Daniel Raven-Ellison's, but it's brilliant because it's capturing the imagination. It's taken the All London Green Grid, which, let's face it, is a really boring planning term of an amazing thing, and turned it into community action. And so I'm very optimistic that people are going to forget the politicians who just drive it forward, you know. And
Tiffany, the people you work with at NEF, the clients or the research partners, are most of them just in a kind of sense of mitigation and adaptation, or are they in a sense of actually looking at the way they work in a quite radical manner?
I guess there's a mixed bag, and along with what we try and push is for more structural reforms, and we think that urgency is necessary, but a just transition is also necessary, and you can't have one or the other, both have to happen simultaneously. And I think that's why people-led policymaking is one of our core priorities right now. And tying back to your first question about politics and the current government, I think one of our mistakes as an organization in the run-up to the election was perhaps relying too much on a Labour victory. NEF wrote along with the Labour manifesto, spent a lot of time thinking through policies, radical policies, and how to implement them, how to fund them. And obviously after the election, there's a lot of a sense of defeat and loss, as many progressives felt. And I think now we are really investing more in the people-led policymaking, building that base, having a lot of collective action, strengthening unions, and really engaging with people on the ground, so that instead of relying on a new government or politicians take the lead, we can make our agenda, or a progressive agenda, a more radical agenda, common sense. So it's not about who's in office, but it's that people demand and will enact a more radical vision, because that's just common sense.
Which chimes with some things that Duncan was saying. So let's see if there's any questions from the floor. There's a microphone at the back, so if you put your hand up, I can't see a thing because the light's in my eyes. Any questions? There's one in the front here, and then they will pour out. Thank you for being first.
I'm the second. Thank you very much. Joe has mentioned one simple thing we could do if we have a downpipe on a garden. Claire has mentioned it starts at home, and we need to, start small. So we've got a room of, I don't know how many people here, maybe 100 people or more. Can you give us one takeaway, apart from the obvious, apart from our recycling, compost making, can you give us something to take away with this that we can think about doing at home? today or tomorrow. Thank you.
Who wants to start on that? Duncan.
All right. I ended my talk with it basically, which is to find your community and get active. So if you just phone if you have an idea that something you want to start, phone somebody, arrange a meeting in a pub. The whole of that Brixton Energy stuff started with 4 of us sitting around talking what if in a pub. And then we found out who wasn't there, and then we went and got them, and then, it snowballed. And it brings you benefit because you end up working with brilliant people on amazingly solutionist stuff.
I mean, the most obvious answer is to do with eating. That one of our biggest carbon footprints is in our food. So reducing down to vegetarian or vegan makes a huge difference to your carbon footprint.
But we need livestock. We need grazing. We need to.
You need to get George Monbiot on the panel then.
It will be up here.
Or Simon Fairley. Yeah. I mean, we have an ecology that evolved with grass, and it's very and the average age of farmers in this country is 59. They are not people who change fast. The only thing, as I say, the only way that change happens if people see it's to their advantage and they're going to get some benefit out of it. I agree with you. It's going to be impossible to, ecologically, it's impossible to turn the whole country vegan, but organic halves your.
But I think it's like we're all saying. I mean, from last year to this year, if you went to all the trade shows, there's a seismic change in attitude of the way in which people are displaying their overtly displaying their environmental policies, the way in which that there is a really big change at trade level. Then I think community is absolutely critical because you give confidence to each other if you work with each other. So what happens on the allotment is then just kind of built out into a larger structure, and I think it's inspiring other people that to change those small habits are possible. So it might be the car, or it might be to do with sharing your own garden space for growing on, or just growing your own herbs so they don't have to be imported from Israel. But I mean, there's I think there's multiple layers. But I think the trouble is that that there's a lot of I think something like Nature Now, which is the George Monbiot and Greta Thunberg film, takes your breath away when you watch it, and then you feel quite frightened at the end. So it's kind of, there needs to be something which, as you're saying, Karen, needs to be more practical as a follow-up to that, the backstory. So what can we do,
Any other one-line
Yeah, I think
instructions?
Just between our home life and our professional lives, I heard a fact once, I don't know how true it is, but that 200 vegans are 1% of a building's operational load if it's a large building. So we have to question our professional lives and our home lives. While we can hope that 200 people turn vegan, in fact, just by putting pen to paper, we can change the same amount in one building. So we really, really must do that.
Also, transport is one of the top sources of emissions, especially in cities, and in the UK, transport emissions have just kept going up. So as a cycling campaigner, I would encourage more people to cycle. But I also want to caveat, I guess, this question and the responses with just the fact that it's not demand-side solutions alone. We have to look at the supply side. We can get individual people, masses of people, to change their behaviors, but ultimately we need supply-side solutions. Policies, practices, the built environment have to change to enable people to make these better choices.
And I think plant trees.
Maybe I just wanted to address the architectural students or design students in the room more than you guys as part of a home. And I would say just rebel to the traditional architectural office. And we're teaching also a course about radical practice at the RCA, and it's just astonishing how much some of these conversations just never get brought up during your master's or undergrad, and like rebel against the traditional, proprietary title of the architect and the proprietary understanding of your designs are just yours, right? It's like it's a moment in which, as architect, we are just the last one of like the entire ecosystem of practices and practitioners that will like hold on to that one design that they've made. We need to just stop thinking that way.
I hope you're preaching to the converted with the Central St Martin students. Is there any more questions? Other questions? Liza?
It's more of a reflection. I think one of the things all the speakers have in common is departing from that model of working alone. And so I'm lucky. Joe's and mine 10th anniversary is just passed of collaborating together. But just think of the new Economics Foundation talking about making alliances with the unions rather than demonising them, and seeing that change is painful and difficult, and the fact you had 100 authors. And I think that is the thing that's powerful. And it is harder for students, isn't it, when they're feeling like they're having to produce a body of work. But the encouragement to work together, work as a group, and share knowledge, I think, is something that all 5 of you have really communicated. But maybe, Carlotta, when you talk about, we've described the gap value. The problem is there are lone figures in local authorities who are trying to protect a tree when the regeneration department or the planners are giving permission to create these empty sites. And so I think every time we come across the beleaguered person attempting to work alone, find a way to support them rather than virtue signal that they ought to be doing something different. So I think that's something I really got from everybody's presentation today. Thank you.
In response to that, at NEF, we did a theory of change workshop with architects to declare climate and biodiversity emergency. So I would encourage all of you students to look at the declaration, see who the signatories are. Lots of big firms have signed up. Smaller ones have signed up as well. And at this point, the network, the movement is thinking about what to do next. We've declared climate and biodiversity emergency. What do we do? So input would be useful, and just shaping the direction of what the industry, what the sector can do.
So that we had Joe from the ACAN a fortnight ago, and he made that point too. Architect Climate declares, I think we need to treat with a bit more suspicion, because particularly the Sterling Prize ones, because three weeks after they declared, 3 of them had announced big new airport projects. And that's a slight problem. So the ACAN lot are really like, they work with Letty on that thing, and I think that Liza's right to this sort of sense of kind of collective endeavour. Any more questions? There's one at the back, I think. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you very much for that. I have my mind full of interesting thoughts and insights, so thank you for that. I can't stop thinking about these initiatives that you are all presenting and their link to policy and politics, because we are talking a lot about trees. And not only in the UK, but globally, we have a Bolsonaro burning the Amazon. And as an industry, I'd like, first of all, to know how many of you in the panel are architects? Like you asked us, okay. As an industry, what we see is that architecture is recognized through people like Bjarke Ingels, who is, having his photograph taken with Bolsonaro, and he's flown to Brazil because he's offering something that, as a profession, we are still praised for in the sphere of power, which is symbolism, which is certain kind of form. And they deny all the local beautiful knowledge that the architects of Brazil have and fly this Danish guy to make an icon for them with Bolsonaro. Yeah? So I think another elephant in the room when we talk about politics is also the aesthetics and the visualization of how the built environment will take shape in the climate emergency context. And my question to you, when you're talking to us as architects who have been trained through making images and through design, is how do you imagine, say, beyond the buildings having solar panels on top of them and plants on top of them and looking like a green port, yeah? How do you imagine the link that we as architects, as an industry, can establish with the spheres of power through the aesthetics and the symbolism of the new world which is in a climate emergency? I don't know if I make myself clear. But I am worried about that.
Yeah, I would perhaps like to reframe or look at your question from another point of view, which is actually, I would hope that as architects who have been trained as designers more than as kind of image makers, and actually I believe that that is what is incredibly powerful, together with the fact that we can actually make pretty images. But actually, I am quoting Marco Steinberg, which is kind of a strategic designer. Maybe some of you might know him. And I remember when he came to teach our students last year, he basically looked at me and he was like, you know, a policymaker can agree to disagree. Architects cannot agree to disagree where the plumbing system goes. And I think there is this slight difference between policymakers and designers, which is the fact that actually we can be propositional. Because as you're saying, we need to reimagine. It's not about the plant and the solar panel. Like our cities will have to look totally radically different, right? Like I cannot even imagine how they are. Like I'm struggling to draw this, you know, the trees as infrastructure drawing, because actually I should spend much more time thinking about how they radically look differently. So I think it's the combination of both, right? And these are things that, you know, they go all the way from how they will look to the kind of, you know, agreements and incentives that we'll put in place, all new things that are actually going beyond the physical construct, all the way to the kind of, you know, bureaucracy behind them.
So
If
Claire,
that makes sense.
Does Letty ever talk about aesthetics?
We do, and that's because we're a complete mix of people. So we have architects and engineers often arguing about aesthetics of buildings and how much that means. But I think it's really important to remember that while we can put eco-bling on our building and that can send a message out and that message can be useful sometimes, we also need to think about the quiet sustainability of our building, the practical sustainability, and whether we can indeed end up with both beauty and sustainable building. And I think this year's Sterling Prize has kind of shown that you can have the ordinary and you can have quiet beauty in something that is actually highly sustainable. And so I think working on that and not fighting the process is a really important part of our education and as a practice too.
But I think if we're talking about, as you're saying, envisaging a new city, it's got to be to do with working with nature. It's got to do with restoring natural processes. And nature has its own aesthetic. You know, we're lucky. It's kind of, we are inherently connected to natural process, and it's something that almost there's an extinction of experience that's happened, which means that we have to be reminded of that connection. But we need to do that. We need to understand the way in which we've disrupted the city as an organism, and then we need to decide not how we restore nature. It's not to do with mitigation, it's not to do with restoration, it's how we envisage a kind of second nature, which is to do with our stewardship of the soil, of the catchment, and that means the river on which, you know, the catchment of London is enormous. It impacts a lot of upstream communities. We can't just look at a building plot. We have to look at the whole way in which we are creating impact at a point in a catchment. And unless we get into a framework of a kind of understanding about natural systems and a larger, more generous and more upstream thinking, then I think, you know, we're going to miss a lot of opportunities, and nature will, greenwash has got nothing to do with this discussion. That is just used by various people just because it's easy to colour in the tops of roofs green. We're talking about an inherent change in approach to the way in which we create this habitat, which we call a city. And that was, you know, that's our responsibility to do that. And it's going to take vision, and it's going to take more than engineers and architects. It's going to take landscape architects, it's going to take social anthropologists. It's going to take a whole myriad of really interesting cross-sector thinking out of silos to do that, which is exciting.
And I think that summarises the evening's debate. So on that, I think we've all been a bit nice to each other. We probably need Paul Finch chairing this rather than me. But thank you very much, and thank you to the audience. You've been incredibly attentive and serious, so thank you for that as well. So the discussion, less serious and less attentive, will go on down in the bar. Thank you very much.